My name is Renata Voss. I'm 38 years old. 15 years ago, at my father's retirement dinner, my mother stood up in front of 91 guests, held a small gift bag toward me, and said, "We didn't know what to get the daughter who never really contributed, so we got you a mug." Inside was a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest daughter." My brother Colton, who had just been handed the keys to our family's construction company, a company I had spent 9 years helping build from the ground up, unpaid, uncredited, laughed so hard he had to put down his wine glass. What none of them knew, as they toasted his future and photographed my humiliation for the family group chat, was that 11 months earlier, my grandfather had quietly rewritten the deed to the land the entire company was built on, and put my name on it alone. They had just crowned a king of a kingdom he didn't actually own. Before we get into this, if you are new here, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one, but only if this story resonates with you. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people finally stop being quiet, and the truth, when it finally arrives, never has to raise its voice. I grew up in Larkspur Hollow, a small town in the foothills outside of Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of place where everyone's father either worked at the mill or, like mine, ran a construction outfit that built half the houses in the county. My father, Walt Voss, founded Voss & Sons Construction in 1979 with a bank loan, a used dump truck, and my grandfather's land as collateral. By the time I was born, the company had grown into the biggest builder in 3 counties. My brother Colton came along 4 years before me, and from the moment I could walk, the roles in our house were assigned and unchangeable. Colton was the son. I was, as my mother liked to say with a little laugh that was never really a joke, the backup plan. My mother, Doreen, was the kind of woman who ironed napkins for a Tuesday dinner. She wore pearl earrings to the grocery store and believed sincerely that a family's worth could be measured by how it appeared to the neighbors across the cul-de-sac. Her cardigans were always cashmere, always folded a specific way over the back of her kitchen chair, and she had a way of complimenting you that somehow always contained a small blade inside it. "You look so put together today," she'd say to me, in a tone that made clear this was a surprise rather than an expectation. Colton was loud, easy to love in a room, terrible with money, and utterly incapable of finishing anything he started. I watched him fail out of 2 colleges, total 3 cars, and get let go from 4 jobs before he turned 25, and every single time, my mother found a way to make it someone else's fault. A bad boss, an unfair professor, a girlfriend who didn't understand him. My father never argued with her. He just nodded, wrote another check, and went back to his newspaper. He wasn't cruel. He was just absent in the specific way that lets cruelty happen right next to him without him ever having to own it. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the responsible one in a family that doesn't reward responsibility. I learned early that being competent just meant being handed more, without any accompanying credit. When I was 12, I organized my own birthday party because my mother forgot to book the venue she'd promised, and forever after, that became a running family joke. "Ren just handles things," they'd say, as if my capability were a personality quirk rather than a survival skill I'd built out of necessity. Nobody ever asked what it cost me to be the one who just handled things. Nobody ever noticed that I stopped asking for help around age 10, because asking had never once produced anything except a longer wait and a smaller answer. I was the opposite kind of child, which turned out to be its own kind of curse. I brought home straight A's and nobody mentioned it at dinner. I won the regional science fair in 8th grade with a bridge load bearing project, irony not lost on me now. And my mother spent that whole dinner talking about Colton's baseball tryout, which he didn't make. I have one photograph from that science fair. It's not of me holding my ribbon. It's of my grandmother Opal standing next to me, holding it up herself because nobody else in my family thought to. I remember specifically the night of my high school dance recital and Colton's baseball championship falling on the same evening. My parents split up for exactly one event, and it wasn't hard to guess which one they chose. My father went to Colton's game. My mother came to my recital 40 minutes late, sat in the back row, and left before the finale because Colton had texted that his team was headed to celebrate, and she didn't want to keep the boys waiting. I finished my final number looking out at an empty seat where she'd been sitting, and I remember thinking very clearly, even at 16, I am going to have to build my own audience someday, because this one isn't coming. Opal, who couldn't make it that particular night because of a hip surgery recovery, sent a card the next morning with $40 in it, and a note that said, "I heard you were extraordinary. I already knew you would be." I still have that card. It's the only thing from my childhood I kept in a fireproof box. Opal was my father's mother, and she was the only person in that house who ever looked at me like I was already whole, not a project to be finished. She'd been a bookkeeper for 40 years before she retired, sharp as a blade even at 80, and she was the one who taught me, quietly, over her kitchen table, how to read a balance sheet, how contracts worked, how liens got filed, how land got deeded. Saturday mornings, while my mother took Colton to travel baseball and my father caught up on paperwork at the office, I'd walk the half-mile to Opal's little house on Birchwood Lane, and she'd have 2 mugs of hot cocoa waiting and a stack of old ledger books spread across her kitchen table, and she'd teach me, patiently, the way some grandmothers teach knitting, how debits and credits worked, how a business could look profitable on paper and still be one bad quarter from collapse, how the person who understood the numbers was always, quietly, the person who actually held the power in any room, whether anyone else in that room realized it or not. She used to say, "Renata, the people who never raise their voice are usually the ones who already know how the story ends." I didn't understand what she meant until I was 37 years old, sitting across a desk from my father and brother with a certified deed in my hand, watching 2 men who'd never once had to fight for anything in their lives finally understand, in real time, that the ground could shift under people who never bothered to check where they were standing. I went to community college for 2 years, studied civil engineering technology, and instead of going further, I did what felt, at the time, like the responsible thing. I came home and went to work for my father's company. I told myself it was temporary, a way to save money before transferring to a 4-year program. But my father needed help with scheduling that first summer, and I was good at it, genuinely good at it, in a way that felt like the first thing in my life anyone had ever specifically needed from me rather than merely tolerated. 1 summer became 1 year, 1 year became 9. 9 years later, I was still there, running project scheduling, managing subcontractor relationships, personally saving the company from 2 lawsuits and 1 catastrophic bid error that would have bankrupted us in 2014, back when a miscalculated concrete order on the Ashcombe development nearly cost us the entire spring season, until I spent 11 straight nights on the phone renegotiating supplier terms nobody else in the office even knew existed. I did all of this as an hourly employee with no title, no equity, and a salary that hadn't moved in 4 years, while Colton floated in and out of the office 2 days a week wearing sunglasses indoors, collecting a vice president of business development salary for a job that mostly consisted of taking clients to lunch and losing the invoices. I documented everything, not out of some grand plan at first, just habit, the same habit that made me good at my job. Every project I saved, every all-nighter I pulled before a permit deadline, every email where Colton promised a client something physically impossible and I had to quietly fix it after. I kept a navy blue binder in my desk drawer, and later a shared drive folder labeled, blandly, Project Archive, because I'd learned by then that the most dangerous things in my family were the ones that looked interesting. When I was 36, my grandmother Opal got sick. Pancreatic cancer, caught late, the kind of diagnosis that reorganizes a family's priorities, whether they want it to or not. I was the one who drove her to chemo. I was the one who sat with her during the long afternoons when the treatment made her too tired to talk, just held her hand while she slept. My mother visited twice. Colton visited once and brought his golf clubs because he had a tea time after. During one of those quiet afternoons, Opal told me something that changed everything, though I didn't fully understand its weight until much later. "The land the shop sits on," she said, her voice thin but steady. "Your grandfather put that in trust to me before he passed, so your father couldn't mortgage it out from under himself the way he tried to with the equipment yard. I never told Walt. I never told anyone. I've been sitting on 40 acres this whole time, Renata, and I've been watching how this family treats you, and I've made a decision." She reached into her nightstand drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside was a deed, notarized 11 months before, transferring that land, the physical ground the company's headquarters, shop, and equipment yard sat on, solely into my name. "They can have the company," she told me. "I'm giving you the ground it's standing on." I want to be clear about something because I know how this sounds. I did not ask for this. I did not scheme for it. I sat there in that hospital room and cried and told her I didn't want it, that I just wanted her to get better. She squeezed my hand and said, "I know, that's exactly why it's yours." Opal died 6 weeks later. At her funeral, my mother wore a new black dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion and told 3 separate people how close she and Opal had been. The land transfer sat quiet in county records for almost a year. I never mentioned it to anyone. I kept working, kept documenting, kept watching my father slowly hand my brother more and more responsibility he wasn't equipped to carry, while my own name stayed off every door, every letterhead, every conversation about the future. Then came the retirement dinner. My father decided to retire at 68, and the family rented out the back room of the Magnolia House, the nicest venue in Larkspur Hollow, for 91 guests, clients, subcontractors, the mayor, half the county's business community. Round tables draped in cream linen, a string quartet my mother had hired against my father's wishes, a slideshow of 45 years of Voss & Sons projects playing on a screen behind the head table. I remember helping set up that slideshow myself, 2 nights before, pulling photos from job sites I'd personally managed, watching my own handwriting on old permit applications flash across the screen without a single caption acknowledging whose work it actually was. It was there, in front of every person who mattered to Voss & Sons Construction, that my father stood up and formally announced Colton as the new president and sole owner of the company. Not co-owner, not with me in any role at all. Sole owner. He talked for 6 minutes about Colton's vision and leadership, about how proud he was to see his son carry the family name forward, and never once said my name, not even in the polite throwaway way you'd thank a spouse or a sibling in a speech like that. I sat at the family table in the dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, smiling the smile I'd been trained since childhood to produce on command, while 91 people I'd personally built relationships with over 9 years watched my father hand my entire career to someone else without a single word of acknowledgement that I had ever been in the room at all. Then my mother stood up with that gift bag and delivered the line about the mug in front of everyone, and the room laughed, not cruelly most of them, just uncomfortably, the way people laugh at things they don't fully understand but sense they're supposed to find funny. Colton didn't just laugh. He stood up, raised his glass, and said, loud enough for the whole room, "To the family business, the one that finally has a real leader." He looked right at me when he said real. I remember setting my water glass down very carefully on the white tablecloth. I remember folding my napkin into a small, exact square. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I sat there and felt something inside me go completely, permanently still. Not sad still, but decided still, the way a lake goes flat right before a storm arrives. I thought about Opal's hand in mine. I thought very clearly. They just spent 6 minutes describing a kingdom that isn't theirs to give away. I'm going to pause here for just a second. If this story is hitting close to home, if you've ever sat at a table and watched someone else get credit for years of your own work, hit that subscribe button. I promise you it's worth staying for what comes next. And if you've ever been the one who just doesn't contribute, type "the ground beneath them" in the comments. Now back to the story. I didn't say anything that night. I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, and pulled out the folder I'd kept for 9 years. I read through every project file, every email, every saved contract until 3 in the morning. Then I called an attorney named Priya Anand, a woman Opal herself had recommended to me 2 years before, just in case you ever need someone in your corner who isn't blood. I hadn't understood then why she'd said it that way. I understood it now. Priya and I met the following week. I laid out the deed to the land, the 9 years of documented project work, the payroll records showing my actual contributions against Colton's actual absences, and the retirement announcement itself, which had already been filed with the state as a formal transfer of company leadership, a transfer that had somehow never once addressed who actually owned the ground the business physically operated on. "Renata," Priya said, looking up from the deed, "your family just built a company announcement on land they don't own. Your grandfather's business, the operating entity, that's your father's to give away. And he gave it to your brother. That's legal. That's his right. But the shop, the yard, the office building itself, that's yours. They cannot operate a construction company out of a headquarters they don't hold title to without your consent, not legally, not for one more day, if you choose." I sat with that for a long moment. I want you to understand something about what happened next, because it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not do this out of revenge. I did not want to burn the company down or watch my father's life's work collapse out of spite. I asked Priya one question. Can I make them understand what I actually built without destroying what my father built? She told me there was a way. It would just require them to finally sit across a table from me and listen. Over the following month, quietly, methodically, we prepared. Priya drafted a formal notice, not a lawsuit, not yet, just a notice of landowners' rights and a request for a meeting regarding continued use of the property. I gathered every project file into a single organized binder, this one navy blue, the same color as the one I'd kept in my desk for 9 years, except now it had a title page, Voss & Sons Construction, 9 years of project history, prepared by Renata Voss. I did not add a single dramatic word to it. I let the numbers speak. 41 completed projects, 11 crisis interventions that saved the company from breach of contract penalties, 2 lawsuits personally averted, $412,000 in fees I had negotiated down through relationships I'd personally built with subcontractors over nearly a decade, 0 equity, 0 title, 0 mentions in 9 years of company newsletters, which I had, of course, also kept. Priya and I spent 3 separate evenings at her office going through the county's zoning and utility records to confirm exactly how the property lines had been drawn, because she wanted to be absolutely certain there was no ambiguity before we brought anything to my family. It turned out the original 1979 deed my grandfather had used as collateral had actually only covered 30 of the 40 acres, the remaining 10, including the section where the equipment yard and half the shop building now sat, had been quietly purchased by my grandfather 2 years later and folded into the same family trust Opal had eventually inherited outright. In other words, this wasn't some technicality I could be talked out of. It was clean, it was documented, and it had been sitting in county records the entire time, waiting for someone to actually look. I also spent an evening driving out to the cemetery where Opal was buried, which I know might sound strange to include in a story like this, but I want to be honest about what this process actually felt like from the inside. I sat on the grass next to her headstone for close to an hour before I said anything out loud. I don't want to be the villain in this, I told her. I don't want Dad to lose everything he built. I don't believe in signs, not really, but a breeze came through right then and moved the little pinwheel someone had left on a neighboring grave, and I let myself take it as permission anyway. I think what I actually needed, sitting there, wasn't a sign from Opal. I needed to hear myself say the plan out loud to someone who wouldn't immediately try to talk me out of what I deserved, and the only person who had ever done that for me wasn't alive to do it anymore, so I borrowed her memory instead. I requested a meeting at the company office, the same building that sat on my land, for the following Friday morning. I did not tell them why. I only wrote, "There's something about the property I need to discuss with both of you, as owner and as retiring founder. Please have Colton present as well." I'm going to pause here again, just for a moment. If you've ever quietly built the evidence of your own worth while everyone around you underestimated you, type "I documented everything too" in the comments below. I want to know I'm not the only one. Now let's get to that Friday morning. I arrived at the office at 9 a.m. sharp, wearing the same navy blazer I'd worn to every serious client meeting for 9 years. Priya came with me, calm, unhurried, carrying nothing but a slim leather folder. My father was already there, sitting behind the big oak desk that had been his father's, looking pleased with himself in the particular way retired men do when they think the hard part is finally over. Colton arrived 11 minutes late, still in his golf shirt, clearly annoyed at being called in on a Friday. "So," my father said, glancing at his watch, "what's this about, Ren? We've got the Hendricks site walkthrough at 11. I set the binder on the desk between us. I did not open it yet. "Before we talk about the Hendricks site," I said, my voice even, "I need to talk about the land this building sits on, and this office, and the equipment yard behind it." Colton let out a short laugh, the same laugh from the retirement dinner. "What about it? Dad owns it. Or, I own it now, I guess, technically." "No," I said. "Neither of you do." I watched my father's face change first. Not confusion, not yet, but the particular stillness of a man doing quiet math in his head and not liking the answer. I opened the folder Priya handed me and slid the deed across the desk. Grandma Opal held this land in trust after Grandpa passed. 11 months before she died, she transferred it into my name. It's recorded with the county. I have the certified copy right here. My father picked up the document with both hands, the way he used to hold blueprints, and read it twice before he set it down. For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside the window, I could hear the crew starting up the excavator in the yard, completely unaware that the ground under their machine had just quietly changed hands almost a year earlier. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so enormous could happen in complete silence, recorded on a single page in a filing cabinet at the county courthouse, while life just kept going on top of it, oblivious. My mother, who I hadn't even mentioned had arrived and taken a seat by the window, made a small sound, somewhere between a scoff and a gasp. "That's not possible. Opal would have told me." "She told me," I said. "She told me because she watched what this family did to me for 37 years, and she decided, quietly, without asking anyone's permission, to make sure I never had to depend on any of you again." Colton reached for the deed, scanned it, and his face went from annoyed to pale in about 4 seconds. This is insane. You can't just— The company's been operating out of here for 45 years. The company has, I agreed. But the company doesn't own the ground. You do own Voss & Sons Construction now, Colton. Congratulations. Genuinely, that part is legitimate and it's yours to run. But every truck in that yard, every piece of equipment in that shop, every client meeting in this office is happening on land that belongs to me. And as of this morning, I haven't given anyone permission to continue operating on it. My father found his voice then, low and tight. Renata, what is this? What do you want? I opened the second binder. I want you to actually see what I did here for 9 years, since apparently a coffee mug was the closest anyone got to an honest assessment of my contribution. I walked them through it, slowly, methodically. The 41 projects, the averted lawsuits, the relationships with subcontractors that had personally saved them hundreds of thousands of dollars. I did not raise my voice once. I did not call anyone names. I simply laid the truth on the desk, page by page, the way Opal had taught me to read a balance sheet, without adjectives, without performance, just numbers that could not be argued with. Colton tried to interrupt twice, tried to say I was exaggerating, and both times I simply handed him the underlying documentation. His own emails, his own missed deadlines, his own client complaints that I had personally resolved without ever telling my father, because I'd been protecting the family business even as the family made it clear I wasn't really part of it. By the third document, he stopped interrupting. This is the Kessler contract, I said, sliding a page across the desk. You told them the retaining wall would be done by the 15th. You knew we couldn't pour concrete in that weather window. I called them myself, renegotiated the timeline, and covered the penalty clause out of the contingency fund before Dad ever saw the invoice. That was 2 years ago. I slid another page. This is the email where you told a supplier we'd pay net 30 when our actual terms were net 60, and I spent 4 days on the phone smoothing that relationship back out before they dropped us entirely. I wasn't raising my voice. I want to be very clear about that, because I know how these stories usually go, and I know you might be expecting me to finally snap, to finally yell everything I'd swallowed for 9 years. I didn't. I'd promised myself, sitting in that cemetery, that I would not become loud just because they had spent my whole life being loud at me. I just kept turning pages, one after another, in a voice as flat and steady as a level laid across a foundation. Colton's jaw tightened. Why didn't you ever say anything? Why didn't you tell Dad I was messing up? Because you're my brother, I said. And because I genuinely believed that if I just kept doing the work well enough, eventually someone in this family would notice on their own. I was 30 years old before I understood that wasn't going to happen. Some women just aren't seen until they stop making it easy not to see them. My mother's voice cut in from the window seat, sharper now, defensive in the particular way she got whenever the family narrative she'd spent decades curating started to wobble. You're being dramatic, Renata. This family has given you everything. You gave me a mug, I said quietly. In front of 91 people. That's the thing you chose to give me, in the one moment this family had to say my name out loud in public. I kept the receipt for that too, actually. $12.40, from the gift shop at the Magnolia House. I'm not being dramatic, Mom. I'm being thorough. There's a difference, and I learned it the hard way, from watching what happens to women in this family who aren't. My mother finally spoke, her voice sharp, defensive. This is exactly the kind of thing you do, Renata. Making everything about you. Your father worked his whole life for this company. He did, I said, and for the first time my voice did soften, just slightly, because this part was true and I meant it. Dad built something real. I'm not here to take that away from him. I'm here because for 37 years, this family decided who mattered based on who was loudest, and I am done accepting that as the final word on what I'm worth. I turned to my father. I'm not shutting the company down, Dad. I'm not evicting anyone today. What I am doing is telling you honestly, in this room, what actually happened here for 9 years, and asking that going forward, the truth be allowed to exist in this family without a punchline attached to it. The room was quiet for a long moment. My father looked at the binder, then at me, and something in his face, the tired, absent, complicit thing that had let my mother run our family's emotional accounting for 4 decades, cracked just slightly. I didn't know about half of this, he said quietly. The Hendricks lawsuit. I didn't know you were the one who— You didn't ask, I said. Nobody ever asked. Consequences, once they start moving in a family like mine, don't need much help from the person who was wronged. They just need the truth to finally be visible. Within 2 weeks, Colton, faced with the reality that he could not legally continue full operations without my consent, and faced with his own documented track record now sitting in black and white in front of the company's insurance carrier, who I had, through Priya, made aware of certain liability gaps he'd been quietly ignoring, offered to formally bring me on as co-owner, with equity backdated to reflect my 9 years of unpaid contribution. I didn't ask for that. He offered it, mostly I think, because his own attorney told him it was the only path that didn't end in a much larger legal fight he would lose. I accepted the equity. I did not accept the apology tour that came with it, not right away. My mother, in the weeks that followed, told several members of our extended family a version of events in which I had ambushed my father and used Opal's illness to steal the land. A story that fell apart the moment my Aunt Priscilla, Opal's actual sister, confirmed publicly at a family gathering that Opal had told her the exact same thing she'd told me months before she died, almost word for word. That was the moment something in my mother's careful social architecture began to genuinely crack. Women she'd known for 30 years at church started asking careful, pointed questions. The story she'd built her whole identity around, devoted matriarch, wronged mother, didn't survive contact with people who'd actually known Opal. It didn't stop there either, though I want to say again that I never pushed any of what came next. I only stopped protecting people who had never once protected me, and it turned out that was enough on its own. Colton's college roommate, who'd become a supplier rep in the area, mentioned at a Chamber of Commerce mixer that he'd heard Voss & Sons was having some kind of ownership shakeup, and within 2 weeks 3 separate clients had called the office directly, asking who they should actually be signing contracts with going forward. A level of scrutiny the company had never faced before, because for 45 years, nobody outside the family had ever had reason to look closely at how it was actually structured. My father, to his credit, handled those calls personally and told every single one of them the truth, that his daughter had quietly been the backbone of the operation for nearly a decade, and that going forward she'd have the title to prove it. My mother's marriage didn't end, but it changed. I heard secondhand from my aunt that my father had started sleeping in the guest room for a stretch that spring. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a slow, quiet withdrawal that mirrored, in miniature, the same kind of withdrawal I'd learned to do as a child. I don't know everything that happened between them in private, and I've made peace with not knowing. What I do know is that my mother, for the first time in my adult life, called me one Sunday evening in April, alone, without an audience to perform for, and said, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, "I think I need to understand how I got this wrong." I didn't forgive her on that call. I'm not sure I've fully forgiven her even now. But I listened, and for once that felt like enough of a start for both of us. Colton, to his credit, and I want to be fair here because this is a true story and not everyone in it stayed the villain, eventually asked to sit down with me alone, without lawyers, without our parents. He apologized. Not the performative kind, the real kind, the kind that comes with specifics. He told me he'd known, on some level, for years, that I was the reason the company hadn't collapsed under him, and that it had been easier to laugh along at the mug than to sit with what that meant about how he'd treated me. I don't know if I've fully forgiven him. I know I don't hate him anymore, and some days, that's its own kind of peace. My father retired for real, this time quietly, without another dinner. He and I talk now, most Sundays, usually about nothing important. Weather, a job site, a book he's reading. He's never given me the big apology speech you'd want in a story like this. What he did instead, about 4 months after that Friday meeting, was drive out to the land, walk the fence line with me in silence for almost an hour, and then say, "Your grandmother was smarter than all of us." That was as close as he could get, and I've made peace with the fact that it might be as close as he ever gets. I want to pause one more time before we close this out. If you've ever had to be your own advocate because nobody else in the room was going to do it for you, drop the word "enough" in the comments. I read every single one, and I want you to know, you are not too much. You were just surrounded by people who benefited from you staying small. These days, I'm co-owner of Voss & Sons Construction, and I finally have my name on the door, not because I demanded it, but because the truth eventually became too heavy for anyone to keep denying. I still work the long hours. I still love the actual work, the bridges and the load calculations, and the satisfaction of watching something get built correctly. But I built something else too, on a quieter corner of that 40 acres Opal left me. A small workshop with a wide porch, where I spend Sunday evenings with the people who actually show up for me now. My Aunt Priscilla comes most weeks. So does Priya, who started as my attorney and became one of my closest friends. Colton comes sometimes too, and brings his kids. who call me Aunt Wren and don't know the whole story yet, though someday I'll tell them, gently, the way Opal told me. I planted a garden along the south side of that workshop the spring after everything settled. Tomatoes, snap peas, a row of zinnias that Opal used to grow along her own back fence when I was a kid. I didn't plan for it to mean anything symbolic at the time. I just wanted something alive and growing on land that had spent so long being fought over on paper. But there's something that happens when you tend a piece of ground with your own hands, season after season, that no deed or courtroom or family dinner can replicate. It becomes yours in a way that has nothing to do with documents at all. Some Sunday evenings, when the light gets long and gold over the fence line the way it used to at Opal's place, I'll sit out on that porch with a glass of iced tea and just listen to the sound of my own life, finally being lived on my own terms. And I think about how close I came to never doing this, to spending another decade being the quiet, capable one who got a coffee mug at the end of it. I hired someone last year, a young woman named Talia, fresh out of the same community college program I went through, sharp and thorough in exactly the way that used to get overlooked in rooms like the ones I grew up in. I make a point, every single week, of telling her, in front of other people, when she catches something the rest of us missed. I put her name on the emails. I make sure the client on the phone knows whose idea the solution actually was. It's a small thing, maybe, in the scope of a whole company, but I think about how far one sentence, "That was Talia's catch. She should walk you through it," might have carried me, at 26, if just one person in that office had ever said it about me. I can't undo what happened to me, but I can make sure it doesn't quietly happen again to someone else, right under my own roof, while I have the power to say something. My father comes out to the workshop sometimes too, on weekday evenings when my mother thinks he's at the hardware store. We don't talk about the past much. Mostly we talk about a project, or the weather, or nothing at all. Just two people sitting on a porch in comfortable silence, which is more than we ever managed to do together when I was growing up. Last month he brought out an old toolbox that had been his father's, the same grandfather who'd first put that land in trust decades ago without either of us knowing it would matter so much, and he set it down on the porch step and said, "Your grandfather would have liked this workshop." It wasn't an apology. It also wasn't nothing. I still have that mug, by the way. World's okayest daughter. It sits on a shelf in my workshop, not hidden, not thrown away. I keep it there on purpose, not out of bitterness, as a reminder of exactly how little the people who are supposed to see you clearly sometimes actually do, and how much can quietly grow anyway, underneath the ground they never bothered to look at. Talia asked me about it once, early on, half laughing, assuming it was some kind of inside joke. I told her the truth, plainly, the way Opal always spoke to me. She went quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad you kept it instead of them." I hadn't thought about it that way before, but she was right. It was never really theirs to give me in the first place. It had just taken me 37 years and one very patient grandmother to understand that the story it told was never actually about me at all. If there is one thing I would want you to take from this story, it's this. Boundaries are not revenge. Telling the truth in a room full of people who'd rather you stayed quiet is not cruelty. It's the beginning of being taken seriously. You do not have to scream to be heard. Sometimes the calmest person in the room is the one holding the deed the whole time. And if your family has spent years handing someone else the crown while you quietly held up the kingdom, know this. The ground remembers who actually built on it, even when the people standing on top forget to ask. I think a lot now about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, because for a long time I believed they were the same thing, and believing that kept me small for far longer than it should have. Forgiveness, I've learned, is something you can do quietly, on your own, for your own peace, without ever requiring the other person to earn it, or even know it happened. Reconciliation is different. Reconciliation has to be built, slowly, brick, by two people who both show up honestly to lay them. I've forgiven my mother in the sense that I no longer carry the daily weight of that mug, that dinner, those 37 years. But I have not fully reconciled with her, and I may never get all the way there, and I've stopped treating that as a failure on my part. Some bridges only get rebuilt if both people are willing to stand on the same side of the river and start passing stones back and forth. I'm willing. I'm still waiting to see if she is. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. You are allowed to stop performing smallness just because it once kept the peace. The peace it kept was never really yours to protect in the first place. It belonged to the people who benefited from your silence, and they were never going to hand it back to you voluntarily. You have to be the one who finally sets the glass down carefully, folds the napkin, and decides quietly that the story is going to have a different ending than the one everyone else already wrote for you. That's my story. If this reminded you of someone in your own life, someone who's been quietly carrying more than they've ever been credited for, share it with them. Tell me in the comments, would you have handled that Friday meeting the same way I did, or would you have burned it all down? I genuinely want to know, and I'll be reading through every answer, especially the ones from people who've never told this kind of story out loud before. Thank you for being here with me. Hit subscribe if you're new. I share stories like this every week, and I'll see you in the next one.